The airplane was never meant to be famous, and from the very beginning it carried the quiet weight of disappointment. On a grey morning, when the hangar doors slid open and the prototype rolled forward on its narrow wheels, there was no applause, no sense of wonder, only cautious silence. American engineers stood with clipboards in hand, already bracing themselves, because deep down they knew what the test results would confirm. This aircraft had been born out of ambition and compromise, designed during a time when aviation was racing ahead faster than budgets, materials, and experience could comfortably allow. It was meant to be a modern airliner, a symbol of progress, efficiency, and commercial promise. But instead it felt like a machine chasing an idea it could never quite reach. Every rivet, every panel, every stressed engine mount seemed to whisper the same uncomfortable truth. This plane was a mistake. The test flights only made that truth harder to ignore. Pilots complained about its sluggish climb, its awkward handling, and its alarming tendency to feel unstable when fully loaded. The engines, which looked impressive on paper, struggled to deliver consistent power, especially during takeoff. Maintenance crews worked tirelessly, tightening bolts, adjusting control, and swapping components, but each fix revealed another flaw. The aircraft was simply too heavy for what it was supposed to do, and shaving off weight meant sacrificing safety, comfort, or reliability. Airline executives took their seats for demonstration flights with polite smiles and left with carefully worded excuses. They wanted nothing to do with an aircraft that promised high operating costs and low confidence. In a market that demanded trust above all else, this airliner inspired none. Inside design offices, the mood grew darker. The project had consumed time, money, and pride. Engineers who had once argued passionately for its potential now avoided eye contact when the aircraft's name came up in meetings. Reports piled up, each one more discouraging than the last. It failed to meet performance targets. It failed to excite buyers. It failed to justify further investment. Eventually, the decision was made quietly and without ceremony. The program would be shelved. The prototype would be sold off, repurposed, or scrapped. Another ambitious idea would fade into obscurity, joining countless other aviation experiments that never made it past the drawing board and test runway. In the United States, this was the end of the story, a footnote in an industry that could afford to move on. But history rarely follows the neat endings people expect. While American officials filed away reports and moved on to newer, better designs, eyes across the Pacific were fixed on the discarded aircraft. Japan, already embroiled in a widening conflict and increasingly isolated from Western technology, was searching desperately for answers. Its aviation industry faced enormous pressure. Long-range aircraft were needed, bombers that could fly farther, carry more, and strike deeper than anything currently available. Resources were limited and time was running out. Every design choice mattered, every shortcut carried risk. In this atmosphere of urgency, the American rejection did not look like failure. It looked like possibility. Japanese observers studied the aircraft with intense interest. Where Americans saw flaws, they saw a starting point. The airframe was large. The range, at least in theory, was impressive. The design was proven enough to fly, which meant precious development time could be saved. In a war where months could decide outcomes, that alone was tempting. Negotiations moved forward, and the unwanted American airliner was purchased, its blueprints and concepts crossing the ocean along with high hopes. There was a quiet confidence among some planners that Japan could improve what America had failed to perfect. After all, necessity had driven innovation before. Why not again? When the aircraft arrived in Japan, it was examined piece by piece. Engineers measured, sketched, debated, and argued late into the night. Modifications were proposed immediately. Stronger engines would solve the power problem. Structural changes would adapt it for military use. Defensive armament could be added. Bomb bays could be carved out of its spacious fuselage. On drafting tables, the rejected airliner transformed into something new, something menacing, something meant for war. Optimism spread through the design teams. This was not just recycling a failure, it was reclaiming lost potential. The idea that America had overlooked something valuable fed a sense of quiet satisfaction. Yet beneath the confidence, the original flaws never truly disappeared. The airframe had been designed for passengers, not bombs. Reinforcing it added weight, and weight demanded more power. More power meant more strain on engines that were already being pushed beyond their comfortable limits. Each improvement introduced new complications. Cooling systems had to be reworked. Fuel consumption climbed. Balance issues emerged as military equipment replaced civilian interiors. Engineers fought these problems with skill and determination, but they were fighting the nature of the aircraft itself. It resisted transformation, as if reminding everyone that it had never been meant for this role. Still, production moved forward, driven by urgency and belief. Test flights were conducted, and while the aircraft flew, it never truly excelled. Pilots reported that it felt heavy on the controls, slow to respond, and vulnerable. But war leaves little room for perfection. What mattered was availability, not elegance. The aircraft was officially accepted, its identity now fully severed from its American origins. It became a symbol of hope, a long-range bomber that could, in theory, change the balance of power. Crews trained with it, learning its quirks, memorizing its limitations, trusting their lives to a machine that carried a troubled past. The irony was sharp, though few fully grasped it at the time. An aircraft rejected by a nation with abundant resources was now being embraced by a nation stretched thin. The same characteristics that had doomed it commercially were now being reframed as acceptable compromises in the face of war. The belief that determination and modification could overcome fundamental design weaknesses became a kind of unspoken gamble. Japan had placed its bet, convinced that what America discarded could still be shaped into something formidable. As the first units prepared for operational use, there was a sense of cautious anticipation. This bomber represented more than metal and engines. It represented ingenuity under pressure, the refusal to accept limits imposed by circumstance. Yet hidden within its structure were all the reasons it had been abandoned in the first place. Those reasons waited patiently, embedded in stressed wings, overworked engines, and an airframe asked to be something it was never designed to be. The stage was set, and the sky would soon deliver its verdict. The aircraft entered service carrying expectations far heavier than its bomb load, and from the first operational flights, reality began to press in. On airfields carved out of dirt and concrete, ground crews stared up at its broad wings with a mix of pride and unease. It looked imposing at rest, taller and larger than many other machines parked nearby, but size alone could not hide its compromises. Engines coughed to life reluctantly, smoke trailing as mechanics listened intently for sounds that hinted at trouble. Every takeoff felt like a test of faith. As the bomber accelerated down the runway, pilots held their breath, waiting for the moment when wheels would finally leave the ground. Often, that moment came late, the aircraft lumbering skyward, as if unsure it truly wanted to fly. Once airborne, the problems became impossible to ignore. The bomber struggled to climb, especially when fully loaded. Pilots were forced to nurse the engines carefully, balancing throttle setting to avoid overheating, while still maintaining enough power to stay aloft. Formation flying was difficult. Faster aircraft had to slow down, while escorts found it challenging to stay in position around a machine that could not easily adjust speed or altitude. Inside the cockpit, gauges demanded constant attention. Temperatures crept upward, fuel consumption ran higher than planned. The bomber's promised range shrank with every adjustment made to keep it flying safely. What had looked acceptable on paper now felt fragile in practice. Defensive capability was another painful revelation. Guns had been added where space allowed, not where tactics demanded. Fields of fire overlapped poorly, leaving blind spots that enemy fighters quickly learned to exploit. Gunners did their best, straining against vibration and cold, but they were fighting geometry as much as opposition. Armor was thin, sacrificed to keep weight from becoming completely unmanageable. Fuel tanks expanded to extend range were vulnerable, and hits often resulted in fires that spread with terrifying speed. Crews knew this. They joked grimly about it on the ground, but in the air, humor gave way to fear. Missions that should have demonstrated strength instead exposed weakness. On long flights, mechanical failures were common. An engine might lose power without warning, forcing a bomber to turn back alone or struggle onward at reduced speed. Sometimes landing gear refused to deploy properly, turning returns into nerve-wracking exercises in skill and luck. Each incident added to a growing list of concerns, but war did not pause for redesign. Reports were written, recommendations made, and then quietly set aside. The aircraft remained in service because there was nothing else that could replace it quickly. For the crews, flying this bomber became an exercise in endurance. Takeoffs were tense. En route legs were exhausting, filled with constant monitoring and adjustment. Approaching enemy territory brought a new layer of dread. The aircraft's size made it easy to spot, and its lack of speed made escape difficult. Enemy fighters circled like predators, probing for weaknesses that were already well known. When attacks came, they came hard. Gunners fired until barrels overheated or ammunition ran dry, but often it was not enough. Losses mounted, and squadrons began to feel cursed by the machine they flew. Yet despite everything, missions continued. Orders were orders, and each sortie was framed as necessary, vital, and urgent. Targets were assigned, bomb loads calculated, routes planned to minimize exposure. Crews gathered for briefings, studying maps and listening to officers speak with forced confidence. No one said aloud what many were thinking, that the aircraft was betraying them. Instead, they focused on routine, believing that discipline and training could overcome flawed metal. Some crews survived multiple missions and began to develop a strange familiarity with the bomber's quirks. They learned exactly how far they could push the engines, how to coax a little more lift during takeoff, how to nurse a wounded aircraft home. Survival became a matter of knowing the machine better than it knew itself. On the ground, maintenance crews worked miracles with limited resources. Spare parts were scarce, tools worn, time always short. Engines were patched and repatched, cannibalized from damaged aircraft to keep others flying. Structural cracks were reinforced, sometimes with improvised solutions that would have horrified the original designers. These crews understood the aircraft's weaknesses intimately. They cursed it, sweated over it, and kept it alive because there was no alternative. Every bomber that returned, riddled with holes and leaking fluids, was another testament to their efforts. As months passed, the aircraft's reputation hardened. Pilots transferred in reluctantly and transferred out with relief. Stories circulated of missions gone wrong, of planes that never returned, of crews lost, not to enemy brilliance but to mechanical failure at the worst possible moment. Morale suffered, confidence eroded. Yet official statements remained optimistic, emphasizing range, payload, and theoretical capabilities. On paper, the bomber was still impressive. In reality, it was bleeding men and machines at a rate that could not be sustained. Strategists faced a painful dilemma. Acknowledging the bomber's failure would mean admitting that a crucial decision had been wrong. It would mean wasted effort, wasted resources, and wasted lives. So instead, the aircraft was pushed into roles that stretched it even further. Longer missions were attempted, heavier loads were carried. Each new demand increased stress on an already overburdened design. Predictably, the results grew worse. Losses climbed, and the gap between expectation and reality widened into something impossible to ignore. Enemy forces, observing patterns, adapted quickly. They learned the bomber's weaknesses and exploited them mercilessly. Interceptions became more efficient. Tactics were refined to attack from angles where defensive fire was weakest. The bomber's lack of speed meant that once engaged, it could not disengage easily. Crews fought with courage, but courage could not compensate for fundamental design flaws. Each loss sent ripples through units, leaving empty bunks and unanswered questions. Still, there were moments of grim determination. Crews formed tight bonds, relying on each other to survive. They shared meals, letters, and quiet conversations before missions, pretending that tomorrow was guaranteed. In those moments, the aircraft faded into the background, becoming merely the stage upon which human resolve played out. But once engines roared and the ground fell away, the bomber reasserted itself, demanding attention, patience, and sacrifice. As the war dragged on and Japan's strategic position collapsed, the bomber's story entered its darkest chapter. What had once been presented as a long-range weapon of reach and deterrent was now little more than a liability that could not be discarded. Fuel shortages crippled training. Experienced crews were gone, replaced by younger men with fewer hours and less confidence. The aircraft, already unforgiving, became even more dangerous in inexperienced hands. Takeoffs ended in crashes, landings shattered undercarriages. Engines failed with increasing frequency, worn down beyond recovery. Every flight felt less like an operation and more like a gamble against probability itself. High command could no longer ignore reality, but acknowledging it changed nothing. There were no miracle replacements waiting in factories. New designs existed only on paper or in tiny numbers. The rejected American airliner, reborn as a bomber, remained one of the few aircraft capable of long-range missions, flawed though it was. And so its role shifted again, from strategic ambition to strategic desperation. Missions were no longer planned with long-term effectiveness in mind. They were planned to delay the inevitable, to buy time measured in weeks or even days. The bomber was sent out knowing it would likely not return because there were no better options left. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere changed. Crews no longer spoke about victory or success. Conversations became quieter, heavier. Letters home were written with care, words chosen as if they might be the last. Some airmen tried to convince themselves that fate would spare them. Others accepted the odds with grim calm. The aircraft itself seemed to sense the shift, groaning and vibrating under loads it could barely bear, carrying men who understood that survival depended as much on luck as skill. In this final phase, the bomber was assigned to missions that erased any remaining pretense of sustainability. One-way flights became common. Fuel calculations no longer included a return leg. Explosives replaced bombs, turning the aircraft itself into a weapon. The transformation was complete and horrifying. A machine originally designed to carry civilians in relative comfort, then awkwardly reshaped into a bomber, now became a flying sacrifice. Crews climbed aboard knowing there would be no landing, no debriefing, no tomorrow. The aircraft's flaws no longer mattered. Speed, armor, defensive fire were irrelevant when survival was not part of the plan. These missions did not turn the tide. They barely slowed it. Enemy forces adapted as they always had, intercepting and destroying the bombers long before they reached their target. Sometimes the aircraft failed on its own, plunging into the sea or countryside before ever encountering opposition. Each loss chipped away at the remaining illusion of purpose. The bomber had become a symbol not of power, but of how far Japan had been pushed. It was no longer a tool of strategy, only a measure of desperation. And yet, within this bleakness, the human element remained painfully vivid. Ground crews saluted aircraft they would never see again. Commanders delivered briefings with voices that struggled to remain steady. Pilots strapped in, performed checklists out of habit, and pushed throttles forward one final time. The bomber roared down runways scarred by years of use, lifted into the air with the same reluctance it had always shown, and disappeared into the distance. Those moments lingered longer than any technical assessment ever could. When the war finally ended, the bomber vanished almost immediately from discussion. There were no parades for it, no proud retrospectives. Wrecks were scrapped or left to rust. Records were buried under the weight of defeat and reconstruction. In Japan, it was remembered with bitterness and sorrow by those who had flown it or maintained it. In America, it was barely remembered at all. The original rejected airliner had already been forgotten, its role in this tragic chapter unknown to most. The irony was complete. One nation discarded it without consequence. Another embraced it and paid the price in blood. History would later judge it harshly, labeling it one of the worst heavy bombers ever fielded. Engineers would point to its fundamental design flaws. Historians would note the strategic miscalculations that kept it in service far too long. Analysts would call it an example of how desperation can turn compromise into catastrophe. All of that is true, but none of it fully captures what the aircraft represented in its final days. It was a mirror reflecting the state of a nation at war, revealing the cost of isolation, urgency, and misplaced hope. The bomber's story ends not in the sky, but in silence. Silence where engines once strained. Silence where crews once laughed nervously before mission. Silence where a machine born of rejection flew until it could fly no more. Its legacy is not one of innovation or success, but of warning. Technology cannot be divorced from context. A design abandoned for good reason does not become strong simply because circumstances demand it. And when war forces people to stake their lives on flawed machines, the machines do not absorb the consequences. People do. In the end, the rejected American airliner did make history, but not the kind anyone wanted. It became proof that not every overlooked idea is a hidden treasure, and not every bold gamble pays off. Sometimes failure remains failure, no matter how desperately it is repurposed. And long after the smoke cleared and the runways fell quiet, that truth lingered, written into the wreckage, and memories left behind. A final, haunting echo of a plane that should have stayed forgotten.